All right, all right. Welcome. This is Lawrence King with Building Top Agents, where we discuss everything with residential real estate in mind, different residential assets and things like that. Today, I have a very special guest on by the name of Barry Bruce. Barry, tell us a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, how long you've been doing it. Give us all the goods, man.
All right. So the goods are, as you can see from all this white hair, whatever I've been doing it for a long time. So I've been doing what I do for 41 years this past October, actually. And what that is a whole lot of very high level asset protection work, tax mitigation work of all kinds, income taxes, estate, generation skipping, gift taxes, etc., and raising financing from a combination of traditional financing sources to private placements of debt and equity, hedge fund financing for the principal owners of good, successful, privately held companies, accredited investors, and people who are trying to get started, flipping their first property and want to make a change in the financial history of their family by using real estate to build equity, build income, build passive income, and all of those kinds of things.
All the goods.
All the goods, man. If I can't find some goods after 41 years, there's something wrong, right?
That's right. So talk to me a little bit. Today I wanted to bring you on. We wanted to talk and discuss different trusts and why people, what's the big thing about having your property in a trust or just an entity opposed to your personal individual name? Tell us a little bit about what is a trust and why or how you can use it and utilize it in real estate.
Okay, couple steps to that answer. First, what a trust is kind of it's a different way of looking at ownership. Okay. If you own a home today in your own name, you have both what's called the legal title to that property and the equitable title to that property. Legal title is pretty close to self-explanatory. It means that you can do with that property what you choose to do with that property. All right.
Okay.
You bought it. You can do with it what you want to. All right. Okay. The equitable title to a property is the right to benefit from the use of that property. You could rent it. You could live there. You could host a party there. Right. You could do whatever it is that you like with that property. Well, if you have both the legal title and the equitable title to a particular asset, then any mistake that you make, you run into the back of somebody at a traffic light, you block their view of the sunset, and they come after you to sue you, right? All of that lawsuit is aimed at you alone because you have both legal title to the asset. That means you could choose to give it up, right? And you have possession of the property as well. That's part of the equitable title, okay? So if you own the asset in your own name, whether it's a piece of real estate, company stock, crypto, whatever, right? Pair of shoes, right? If you own it in your own name, then you have both the legal title and the equitable title to that asset. What a trust does is to separate those two things. With a trust, the legal title is vested, attributed to a trustee, okay? And separate from that, the equitable title is allocated to beneficiaries of that trust. Now, in their simplest form, you can have trusts where you are both the trustee and the beneficiary, okay? You might have heard people talk about revocable trusts or living trusts. Some people call them self-trusteed living trusts. Better, right?
Right.
So in that scenario, you really haven't separated the legal title of the asset from the equitable title because both are possessed by the same human being. One hat you're wearing as trustee, the other hat on the same person, you're the beneficiary, right?
Okay.
And so as you get more advanced and more sophisticated with trust structures, right? Like the revocable or living trust is a really good tool for certain purposes, all right? It's a really good way to avoid probate, right? Which is not the same as estate taxes, but it's kind of related to settling somebody's estate, right?
Right.
And it's also a terrific device to help deal with the consequences of somebody becoming mentally incompetent or physically disabled, etc. In other words, without a device like a living trust, right? If the spouse is hurt in an accident, you have to literally go to the court and be approved as the guardian of their property in order to be able to sign their name legally to sell a house or something like that. You with me?
Okay.
If the asset is owned by the trust and your spouse is the successor trustee, then as soon as you're declared legally incapacitated, or as soon as you've passed, or as soon as you resign, then the successor trustee automatically takes over the management of those assets, right?
Without going to court.
Without going to court. In its simplest form, that kind of trust is really just another name for you, okay? And in the eyes of the tort court, all right, in other words, where people get sued, in the eyes of tax court, all right, there's no tax protection. There's no tax mitigation that's provided by those revocable trusts because whatever happens in that trust is happening to you. You're the trustee and you're the beneficiary, right?
Okay.
As a matter of fact, you don't even have to get a separate tax ID number for that revocable living trust. You can just report any taxable consequences that happen inside that trust on your personal 1040. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
All right. From an
It's new to me right here. So go ahead.
Okay.
We're getting deep now. So talk to me.
From an asset protection point of view, and I'm going to explain this first about this concept of control, right? And we're going to tie it into trusts. We're going to tie it into LLCs. We'll tie it into corporations. It's an important part of understanding real asset protection. And let me just say up front that whether your game plan for providing asset protection is to title assets jointly with your spouse, in which case you can't lose the property unless you're both sued. Well, okay, so you could both get sued pretty easily, right? That's not real effective asset protection, but it's better than owning something in your own name, right? To corporations, LLCs, and all the way to trusts at the far end. The point behind asset protection is that nobody can promise you that you can't get sued, Lawrence. If you paint your fence the wrong color,
they can sue.
They can sue you because you interfered with their brainwaves, right?
Right.
When we talk about asset protection, what we mean by that is if you lose the lawsuit, you still remain in control of if, when, and for how much that lawsuit gets settled. I have clients who were sued by state governments as long ago as 1995, okay, who have yet to pay the first penny on those judgments that the state came after them to collect. Because
back in 95?
Back in 95, they haven't paid any of the principal. They haven't paid any of the accrued interest because specific statutes of all 50 states, in combination with some of the structures we can talk about, prevent the state from enforcing its judgment. Okay? The judgment's still there, right? But the state can't enforce it, right? Or somebody that you run into the back of might have the judgment against you. They might have something that's called a charging order. It's kind of a charging order, sort of a special class of judgment, right? It's you can't take assets with the charging order, but what you can do is if there's a distribution coming to somebody from an LLC or a corporation or a trust, et cetera, if you have a charging order against them, you can step in front of them and take that distribution. You with me?
Yeah.
It's still the capacity to get money, right? But the structures that we utilize as we kind of move up the sophistication level from owning things in your own name or just jointly with your spouse, right, through LLCs and corporations and then on to trusts.
Right.
The intention is to keep you in control of if, when, or and how much you settle a suit for, even if you lose the suit, right? And what I want to emphasize is that literally I have clients who are going on 30 years, right, since they were sued by a creditor as powerful as a state government. A state government's got a lot more authority and rights than the person you run into the back of because you were yakking with me on the phone, right?
Right.
So what makes asset protection a challenge is this concept of control, okay? Let me give you an example. Let's say that you wake up tomorrow and you're Elon Musk, all right? And you look at your corporate bank account and you see that there's $1 billion of money in it that you don't need for operations for the next quarter, all right? And you look in the mirror and you say, self, I think we should take that $1 billion and buy ourselves an island and let's create a vacation mecca for our best customers, our best dealers, whatever, all right?
Right.
Even though he's the chairman of the board, even though he's the largest shareholder, even though he has more control of that board than anybody else, corporate governance law for public companies says he can't make that decision on his own. That decision is a decision that is made at the board of directors level, okay?
Right.
Let's change it. It's you and me. We wake up again tomorrow. We see that there's 20 grand in our checking account that we don't think we need for the next quarter. Okay. So we say, you know what? I think it's time to pack up the grandkids, in my case, the kids in your case, because you're a young guy. I see that. Paint it on. It's time to pack up the kids and head to Disney World. Okay. We're going to take that 20 grand and we're going to do it. All right. And the other part of me looks in the mirror and says, that's an awesome idea, Barry. What do you think? And I say, I think you're a genius and that's a great thing to do. All right. And I take that 20 grand out of the company because I can. All right. Because it's my company, because I'm the president, because I'm the managing member, because I'm the trust, whatever it is, I'm in control of those dollars. Are you with me? Just as much as I'm in control of my personal checking account. So if you get sued, and you've bought into this idea that LLCs and corporations can provide real asset protection, what happens is the plaintiff's lawyer, the lawyer for the person suing you, tries to convince the judge or the jury that you have just as much control of those business assets as you do of your personal assets. So, Your Honor, we ought to dismiss that theoretical invisible wall that's supposed to separate my business assets from my personal asset, right? Yeah. And let's not take any asset off the table, Your Honor. Let me satisfy my client and get my 40% with anything I can get my hands on, all right? Mm-hmm. Now, the situation is different with a company that, in the eyes of the law, they're called widely held, not closely held, not you and me together, you, your best friend from college, right? 3 of your brothers, whatever, small numbers of people. If there are fewer than 35 owners of the business, that business is considered closely held, okay?
Fewer than 35, got it.
Fewer than 35 or fewer. Right. If there are more than 35 owners, it's considered widely held, or in the extreme, it's public, right? There are no cases where that piercing of the corporate veil, so to speak, that's supposed to separate business and personal assets has been successfully prosecuted against a company that has 35 or more owners or is a public company. Okay. If you come down here in reality where the rest of us live, right, we don't have 34 partners. right? We have
Right.
ourselves, or we have a couple of partners, right?
Right.
And in those cases, if you go to state and federal court cases and literally look at what happens, in almost 50% of those cases, the judge or the jury decides in favor of the plaintiff's lawyer. And they tear down that wall that's supposed to separate your personal assets from your business assets. That's how tort works. Okay.
Okay.
And your original question was, what are trusts like? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, because you just went deep
on this, but I'm trying to give you useful information. Okay.
Right. 100%.
On the simple end, the trust is really no different than you, because you're the trustee, you're the beneficiary. It's a revocable living trust, right?
Correct.
As you move up the sophistication scale, then things like who created the trust become important, all right? Like literally, whose social security number got used to get the tax ID number for that trust? Who funded the trust initially with its initial gift of capital? Put a few $100s or a few $1,000s into the trust, all right?
Right.
And that trust agreement becomes more of a contract. And that's the key to real asset protection, is to get, maybe you've heard, if you can't win the game with these rules, you have to change the game. All right. And the secret to asset protection is to get this litigation out of tort court and get it to where it's adjudicated in accordance with contract law. All right. So as you get more sophisticated with the trust structure, the trust itself becomes a contract between the person who created it, that person's called a grantor or a settlor, okay?
Right.
And the initial trustee, okay? And if the terms of that contract, that looks like an estate planning document, right? But it's structured like a contract. If the terms of that contract say that you as the trustee are prohibited from paying any money out of that trust to someone who is not a beneficiary of the trust, then for the courts in California or whatever jurisdiction we're dealing with, for the courts to force you to pay money to somebody who is not a beneficiary would be the same thing as the court forcing you to breach that contract. And there are laws on the books in each of the 50 states and DC and the U.S. territories that prohibit the courts in those jurisdictions from forcing a trustee to breach that contract. Okay. So as you get more sophisticated with the trust and you get more creative with the legal title to the assets, and you start to separate legal title from who can benefit, right? At some point, you get to like the Kennedy family trusts and the Ford family trusts, et cetera, where the beneficiaries are actually not anything more than placeholders while they're alive, right? They can benefit from the trust, but they have no legal right to say where those assets go when they pass. As long as they're alive, as long as they're in the good graces of the trustee, the trust can distribute money to them. It can distribute principal to them. It can buy things for them, right? It can let them use trust-owned assets. But when they die, their role, their ability to benefit from that trust ceases, and other placeholders take their place, right? That's what creates the estate planning opportunities with these trusts. It's what keeps that ability to say where something goes is called a power of appointment in legal terms, right? And if you have a power of appointment over the assets, then those assets are not going to be included in your estate for estate tax purposes. That's why Kennedy family wealth, the Ford money, the Rockefeller money, et cetera, it goes on and on and on without being diminished by estate taxes or generation skipping taxes, et cetera, because the beneficiaries are just kind of like rotating through. Are you with me?
Right.
So without belaboring the point, we've gone from really simple trusts, right, to far more complex trusts. And most of us, especially for the people who are kind of just getting started in their real estate career. They maybe have their first property or two, or they're trying to complete their first flip or something like that, right? We don't need all of the sophistication and the complexity of the Kennedy family trusts, et cetera. We just need a few provisions that adequately separate that legal title and beneficial title, right? And then allow us to have litigation that takes place against the trust completed in accordance with contract law as opposed to tort court. The reason that my client who got sued in 1995 by that state, the reason that he's never had to pay anything on that judgment is because he wasn't the creator of the trust. Someone else was, his dad, right?
Okay.
And the terms of that trust stipulated that the trustee, who was this guy's best friend, right, was prohibited from distributing money from the trust to anyone who was not a beneficiary, and the state of Maryland was not a beneficiary. So the trustee was not legally able to pay that settlement, and the courts, when they got to court, the courts backed the trust agreement to the surprise of that particular state. Okay, so that's what I said in the beginning. Real asset protection isn't keeping somebody from being sued. It's keeping them in control of if, when, and for how much the suit gets settled by changing the venue. Get out of tort court and get into contract law. Are you with me? Okay. Now, so, you also asked about LLCs and corporations and things like that.
Yeah. My main thing is I was going with LLCs. Are those typically when people are flipping homes that they put a property in an LLC opposed to a trust? Or
so here's the surprising thing with LLCs, because we're all brought up as soon as we get into business, as soon as we start investing seriously, one of the first things we're told is to get an LLC, get a corporation, et cetera, right? Correct. Because then you can protect your assets, right? You can draw that line between your business assets and your personal assets. Only if there's a lawsuit and we get into court, 50% of the time, the judge or jury finds in favor of the person that's suing us because they say we have too much control over both parts. It's like one person with a pair of pants and two pockets. We're the same person in that pair of pants. We just have personal assets in one pocket and business assets in the other. And the plaintiff's lawyer is able to drive a wedge through all of that and get rid of that wall. You with me? Mm-hmm. So if we create LLCs, we have a little bit more protection than we have with property in our own names, but we don't have anywhere near the protection that we're led to believe we do in reality, even in states that are famous for asset protection like Nevada, like Delaware, et cetera, right? California, I can tell you that there are court cases in California. I'm sure most of your clients have heard of CBRE. They're a small outfit when it comes to real estate, right? So they had a contract to represent the seller of a commercial property, right? Right. And the seller just didn't like the way they were handling things, so they fired CBRE, brought in another broker, the property gets sold, and CBR is just kind of waiting, right? Property's owned by an LLC. So the sale takes place, sale proceeds are distributed to the four members of the LLC, right? And the LLC gets dissolved. And then CBRE comes to the table. And they press a lawsuit because the contract was broken and they want the commissions on the sale. The California Supreme Court ruled in favor of CBRE and made the members of that now dissolved LLC put the money back into the company to pay the commissions to CBRE. Okay.
Wow. So they had to wait for it to close escrow, then go back.
They chose to wait. They were just sitting there because they knew how the story was going to end. They were just patient like a fox, right? We're going to let this thing play out, and then we're going to go get our commission. Okay. Right. Now, when we're starting in business, we're not told things like that can happen, with LLCs. All right. Correct. There was a court case in Nevada, one of those states where it's famous for its asset protection, right? owners of a water park knew that they had a problem with the piping on one of the parts of the park, one of the fountains or whatever.
Yeah.
And sure enough, somebody slipped. Somebody got hurt by the pipe. All right. And even in Nevada, that case got decided in favor of the plaintiffs and against the owners of the LLC because the plaintiff's lawyer was able to prove that there were maintenance records that had been examined by the owners of the LLC showing that there was a need for repairs, and they had ignored those recommendations, right? So again, the trick is especially for somebody who's new and starting out, right? You don't need to spend tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars for the sophisticated kinds of trusts, all right? But by the time you're starting to maybe portfolio your first property, or you're starting to get serious about flipping some properties, et cetera, or you have other assets someplace, right?
Vacation homes.
You need to get them wrapped inside the superior asset protection that properly structured, but not complex, not expensive kinds of trusts can provide. All right.
Okay. So is a different type of trust than the revocable
the living trust
and the living trust, right? It's a different trust than that.
It's a different trust structure, and that we could talk for hours about that structure.
I don't want, but I just want to make sure we're clear on.
Yep.
So, if I'm just a normal Joe, I own my own property. It's in my personal name, right?
Yep.
Me and my wife own it.
Yep.
It's in our personal name. I go out, God forbid, hit someone in a vehicle, kill them. They want to come back and sue me for everything I have.
Exactly.
Right? That's including that asset, my home. Now, if I own multiple properties, not just that one home, multiple properties in our personal name, they can sue for all of those properties, correct?
They can sue for all of those. All right. Okay. And then what some people do is they'll put each of the properties in its own LLC. Okay. And there is a point at which there's a little bit of protection there. It's kind of like land trust. There's a little bit of protection there. All right. It's called hide the P. If you can make it a little harder for somebody to figure out who to sue, right, then you can kind of call that asset protection. Right. But you got to remember that it's the internet age, right? I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to share my screen or not. So we don't need to. But before we got on tonight, I logged on to a site called neighborwho.com. All right. Neighborwho.com is a website that you can get all kinds of property records from, all right, from all across the country. And I typed in an address for a property that a client of mine owns, so I knew I had the address right, right? And when the record came up, it gives me 7 different deeds in succession, gives me the name of the owner of the property on each deed, right? Well, I happen to know that this client, when he started working with me, owned that property in an LLC, all right? So there's the name of the LLC as the current owner of the property, right? It's in Connecticut. I go to the Connecticut Secretary of State's website and I type in the name of that LLC and I find 2 interesting pieces of information. One is the articles of organization that were filed for that LLC have this guy's name on them, right? And it also gives me the name of the registered agent for that LLC. You know what a registered agent's job is? It's to receive service, right? So if I'm going to sue the owner of that property, it took me about 45 seconds to get all the information I needed, even though that fellow thought that he was protecting his asset by making it harder for people to find out who he was. It took me 45 seconds to get his name and the name of the person to deliver the suit papers to, the service process, the registered agent. It's a public database maintained by every state in the country for LLCs and corporations that are created in those states. All right. A land trust is a little bit different because there's no public database for land trust names. All right.
Right.
But if you ever get a spouse who's really ticked off and would love to be your ex-spouse, and they're interested in trying to figure out how much of the money that you have should be paid over to them, it's interesting how often they might maybe send somebody to pick up your trash the night you set it out, right? And somebody who works for their lawyer is going to sort through that trash and just look for names on envelopes and return addresses and things like that, right? So literally, I'm being facetious, and for the sake of time, I won't extend it. But in this day and age, to think that you can go for very long hiding your identity behind names like that is just naive, okay? And once they find your name and connect you to it, now you're in a discovery process. And if you don't tell the truth, you go to jail for perjury, all right? Again, change the rules of the game. Let them win their lawsuit. If that property is owned by a properly structured trust, they can get their judgment, get their charging order, and they still can't enforce that judgment against the assets in the trust, nor can they force the trustee under state law in each of the 50 states, nor can they force the trustee to distribute assets from that trust so they can step in front of them with a charging order. Are you with me?
I'm with you.
Want to talk about taxes for a second about all these things?
Yeah, well, that was my next question. And also, we're live right now. If anyone has any questions, please do us a favor, put it in the chat. We're answering live questions. We have someone that's monitoring that chat. If anyone has any questions, you're a homeowner, or any questions that you're an investor, whatever, put it in the chat. We appreciate it. Let's talk about what are some of like the potential like tax implications for like transferring your property or your home into a trust or an LLC.
Okay. So if you transfer your property into a living trust, right, there's no tax consequences, either good or bad, because the taxable events that take place within that trust are going to hit your personal 1040. Okay. All right. Now, these more sophisticated trusts that we were talking about have to get their own tax identification number because they're recognized by the IRS as separate taxpayers, like an LLC might be, or a corporation might be.
S-corp, yeah.
Yes, all of those, right? So one aspect of tax planning is to get your hands on multiple tax pockets. It's not a game, right? You're using the law for the things that the law allows you to do. And a revocable trust, living trust, that's a really good thing for those probate and those disability situations, just doesn't provide any tax mitigation or asset protection ability.
Got it.
Right. LLC.
Okay.
If you have an LLC and you own it in you're the only member of that LLC, right? Or you and your spouse are the only members and you live in California, community property state, et cetera, then that trust that only has one member is by default in the tax code disregarded. That's what it's called. All right. It's as if it doesn't exist. The IRS knows that it legally exists, but from a tax point of view, it doesn't exist at all. The tax events that happen inside a single member LLC that takes the default status that the tax code requires, meaning that it didn't elect to be taxed as an S corporation or a regular corporation. The default status for an LLC with one owner is that it files a Schedule C, like a sole proprietor, right, on your personal 1040. Again, we're not getting any tax breaks from creating that, all right? If we have more than one owner of that LLC, then we have a choice to make. We can accept the default tax status, which is a partnership, right, and file a Form 1065, which is a partnership tax return, or we can choose to be taxed as an S corporation, right, or a regular corporation, okay? So let's talk about that. I'm old, right? 25 years ago, my most significant income clients, we did everything we could to get all of them qualified as S corporations because it was just the thing to do at that point in time. Now, 25, 30 years ago, most of the states didn't even have LLC acts, Okay.
Mm-hmm.
As LLCs came along, that default status of either being a disregarded entity or a partnership creates some really interesting tax planning opportunities. If you elect to be taxed as an S corporation, you're fine while you own the asset and it's producing income. But when you sell that asset, things get really ugly. Okay. If you um, uh, if an S corporation distributes an asset out of the S corporation to the owner of that company, say to do some other planning, do some estate planning, do
Right.
some asset protection planning, what have you, then that asset that's distributed out to the owner is taxed at its fair market value minus its tax basis. Well, if it's a truck or a piece of equipment, you probably wrote it all off in the year you bought it using Section 179, bonus depreciation, et cetera. So its
Right.
tax basis is zero, right? If it's a piece of property, you've been writing it off over, say, 27 years, 39 years for commercial property, but most of the time that property is gaining in value, right? So the gap between its tax basis and its value is increasing all the time. And when you distribute it out to the owner so you can do some other planning, that difference between its tax basis and its market value is taxed to the owner of that S corporation as a capital gain. Okay?
Okay.
Not so widely known. Okay? Another thing is if you put real estate into a regular corporation, which almost nobody does anymore, thankfully, right?
Okay.
Then the sale of that property is first taxed to the corporation. And unless you're planning on just letting the money, the sale proceeds sit in the corporation, when you take the money out as dividends or salaries or in some other way, you pay tax on it again, right? Even worse is to accumulate assets, real estate assets, in, say, a self-directed IRA. It's a great way to not have to pay tax along the way, right? But when you get to 59 and a half and you have to, you start thinking about taking money out. When you get to age, 62, 65, whatever, and the IRS says you got to start taking money out, right? Now, those assets that would have been taxed to you as capital gains are taxed as ordinary income. I have a client that had $6.5 million in his self-directed 401k. Okay. It was all real estate. He'd done phenomenally with it. And he was very proud of himself. He should have been proud of what he created. But he was a very sad camper when I explained that $6.5 million was all going to be taxed at ordinary income rates, and that the IRS was going to tell him exactly how much of that money he had to distribute to himself and pay ordinary income tax rates on each year for the rest of his actuarial life. Okay. Now, again, if you go back to the simpler trusts, right, like the living trust, we get no tax mitigation from those trusts, right? But if we go to like kind of middle of the road trusts, right, that are appropriate for people who have, they're just getting started, they maybe have their first couple of properties, or they've flipped a couple of properties, right, and they're starting to make some money at this stuff, right?
Right.
They're doing that work or owning those properties in a kind of trust that's set up for you by someone else, right? It's called a third-party grantor, and all that means is that somebody who's not you, Lawrence, creates the trust for you. Could be your best friend, could be anybody who's not ever going to be a beneficiary of the trust that you create, okay? Right? That person creates the trust. That makes it one of these non-grantor things, okay? And if the trustee in the trust agreement itself is given the right to choose from quarter to quarter, year to year, whether to pay income to beneficiaries or to keep income in the trust, or to pay income to some beneficiaries but not to others, or to make charitable contributions, etc., then there's a particular section of the tax code. If you want to play Trivial Pursuit, it's 642C, okay? And what it says is that there is one class of taxpayer in the entire tax code that has an unlimited charitable contribution, okay? And that is these non-grantor complex trusts, all right? The implication of all of that is that if you wanted to, and you won't want to if you're thinking clearly, but if you want to, you could literally, if you're doing your real estate business through one of these trusts, you could zero out your tax liability by donating money from your trust to, say, a private family foundation, just like Bill and Melinda Gates. Maybe they got a lot more money in theirs than we're going to have in ours tomorrow, right? But the rules are all the same. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, remember, foundation records are all public records, right? You go to the IRS website, you know what page to head for, and you too can get a copy of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's tax return for 2019. That's the most recently filed year. Now, one of the differences between that entity's return and mine is theirs has $55 billion in assets at cost. Okay?
Right.
At cost, right? So there's a few other differences, but that's one. Okay. Now, what most people don't understand who aren't familiar with how these things work is that the Gates Foundation over the years has invested in hundreds of other companies through the foundation. Okay.
Okay.
Some of those companies are nonprofits, and some of those companies are very much for-profit companies. The rules that apply to foundations are pretty complex. They're not hard to deal with. You just have to know what they are. But as long as a foundation gets at least 95% of its income from passive sources, and a passive source to a foundation is a little different than it is with real estate, okay? Interest is passive, dividends are passive, capital gains are passive, rental income is almost always passive, royalty income is passive. As long as that foundation gets most of its income, 95% or more, from those passive sources, then other rules called disqualified persons and self-dealing rules and all those don't apply, because that foundation is not treated as a business enterprise under the terms of the Internal Revenue Code. Okay? So if you think about like most university endowments, right? Most of them are either public charities or private foundations, right? Stanford's is just one of the most successful. I'm going to use that as an example. Technically, it's a public charity, but the principle is the same. The Stanford Foundation filed the Stanford University Endowment is managed by a management company on behalf of the university, right? That endowment has $40 billion in it as of the end of 2022. Of that 40 billion, 40 and then billion with a B. In 2022, that foundation contributed $1.75 billion to scholarships and operating expenses of Stanford University. Okay? 37%, because it's all public record, 37% of that $47 billion is invested in private equity funds. Do you know what private equity funds invest in? Operating companies, either new ideas or turnaround opportunities, etc. Right? Operating businesses. 11% of that 40 billion is invested in operating real estate. Everybody's heard of Silicon Valley, right? Ground zero for Silicon Valley is the Stanford Research Park, right? The Stanford Research Park is owned 50% by the city of Palo Alto and 50% by Stanford University's endowment. Okay. 700 acres of ground, 10 million square feet of commercial office space. And the companies that have been founded in Silicon Valley don't get to operate there rent-free. That money comes half to the endowment for Stanford University. Okay. So some of the rules that apply to these foundations are things like you can't sell assets to it. You can't lend to it. You can't borrow from it. There's some specific rules. But one of the things you can do, as the Gates Foundation proves, is you can co-invest with it. As long as the foundation's interest in, say, this little LLC that you create to buy a rental property, right? you take your trust, all right, one of these, not the simplest of the trusts, but not a too complicated trust. Your trust and the foundation create an LLC together, right? And let's just say that the rental property you want to buy costs $300,000, takes 20% down to get into the deal, right? You're going to get some financing for the rest of it, right? 20% of 300 grand, $60,000, and your foundation's got the $60,000 in it, okay? Your foundation is supposed to be doing public good. These are not jokes, right? But Stanford's endowment has an average annual rate of return in excess of 10% because they're not just investing in Fidelity growth funds, right? The average S&P return is what, 6-7% per year, right? Stanford is diversifying what it invests in to raise the endowment so it can provide more scholarships, right? October of last year, we have a big family. One of my daughters is a young single mom. She has lupus. She's been through cancer fights. She's just got a rough way to go. She has 2 small kids. One of them is profoundly autistic. Will probably never live independently, right? It's hard for her to hold down a job. Well, there's something about horses and autistic kids that just clicks. First weekend in October last year, we sponsored, our family's foundation sponsored a horseback riding event for 25 autistic kids from 3 to 16 for their families. We took care of everything with the horse farms. We had T-shirts designed and printed. We fed everybody. We had hay rides. They had a blast. And I'm telling you, as the grandfather of a profoundly autistic grandson, all right, I blinked back more than a couple of tears watching the fun that he was having and watching the faces of the parents of these other kids who were just enjoying 4 hours on a Sunday afternoon watching their 3-year-old brush a horse that wasn't any bigger than the 3-year-old, right? And somebody else's 16-year-old is climbing up some steps to get on the back of a real horse, right, to ride around the ring for a little bit. It was awesome, right? The more we grow our asset base in our private foundation, the more of those horseback riding events or whatever else, the Wounded Warrior Foundation, the V Foundation, more of those things we can sponsor and provide grants to. You with me?
Yep.
So it's not a game, but if we're co-investing with that foundation, we can actually do some good things for ourselves. For example, we could create that LLC I was telling you about. If the foundation puts up 20% of the money, it's going to own 20% of that LLC. Don't play games with it. If you don't give it 20%, give it 25%. Don't give it less, right? In other words, treat it like something that you might have to answer questions in front of the IRS about one day, right?
Absolutely.
If you distribute cash, 20% of the cash goes to the foundation, right? If you sell the property, 20% of the net sale proceeds go to the foundation. You with me? But you're in that deal too. And the money to get into that property came from the foundation. You signed for the debt. All right. Even if it's not leveraged, if it's an all cash deal, maybe instead of buying one property, you can buy 2 properties because you're co-investing with that foundation. Not so that you can abuse the rules, but so that you can build the asset base of that foundation faster under your own control than you can by investing in some Fidelity mutual funds. You with me?
Right.
Okay. So those are the kinds of things that we can do with trust structures that we can't do with LLCs and corporations. LLCs and corporations are limited to somewhere between 60% and 20% of the income of those entities as deductible contributions. You and I, if we write a check to the church or the Red Cross or the Boy Scouts, etc., we're limited to 60% of our adjusted gross income for that year. If we have more contributions than we can use, we can carry them forward. But for that particular year, we can't deduct more than 60% of our income. Those trusts that we were talking about have an unlimited charitable contribution, right? And most importantly, they have until the last day of the following tax year to actually make that contribution. You and I have to make our contributions by the last day of this year. Our businesses have to make it by the last day of this year.
Absolutely.
Okay? You with me?
So the foundation is the following year.
It's an example of how this is what I tell people all the time about the way that these trusts that help with tax planning and with asset protection work. The trusts themselves provide the best asset protection that we can provide without using international trusts, offshore trusts, right?
Okay.
Offshore is a bad word, right? So we just call them international trusts, okay?
Right.
The best asset protection we can create in the United States is these non-grantor complex trusts with those spendthrift provisions. Those are the things that the state laws say, the trustee you can't force the trustee to breach a contract and all that stuff, okay? The trusts themselves don't do anything to reduce taxes. There are an awful lot of people on the internet that promote the use of trusts as you can defer capital gains in perpetuity. You can eliminate your taxable. No, it's wrong. Okay, you can't. The trusts themselves provide zero tax mitigation. Okay, but if you integrate a charitable entity like a private foundation, like a public charity, you can create your own public charity. You don't have to be the Red Cross to have a public charity.
Well, yeah, that was my next question. Yeah.
Like something that's called a charitable holding company, right? There's several different charitable entities, but if the charitable entity is a part of that overall structure, it's what provides the tax mitigation. The trust then, because of the way they're structured, that non-grantor complex status, right? The only taxpayer that has an unlimited charitable deduction that's created by contributing money to the charity is those trusts. So asset protection is best with those trusts. Tax mitigation is not made possible by the trusts. It's made possible by the charitable entities, but then the trusts make the tax mitigation that's provided by the charitable entities work better. You with me?
Got it.
All right. And what we do all the time is to meet people where they are. Okay. If you're just getting started, then your trust instruments are going to be relatively, compared to a living trust, they're going to be more complex than that, but they're not going to be 80 pages, right? And as your asset base builds, as your income needs change over time, right, then the complexity of those trusts kind of morphs into more sophisticated structures. I said earlier that it's probably not a good idea, even though it's legal and possible to zero out your tax liability. It's probably not a good idea to zero it out. Think about it. If you have no taxable income and you're trying to build a portfolio of rental properties, it's kind of hard to get qualified for financing other than at the worst of hard money rates, right? If you've got no income, right? So we don't tell people to zero out their tax liabilities. What we do is give them the means to solve for a tax liability that's a part of helping them accomplish their objectives, right? If you know that you want to get qualified over the next year or two, right, to purchase this number of properties or do this number of flips or whatever, right, then we sit down or help you sit down with your lenders and plan it out. What kind of income do you need to see from me in order to get me qualified for those larger amounts of financing that I'm going to want in the future, right? And then we pay that tax, right? We pay the tax on that because it's part of how you're building your assets, is getting qualified for the financing, right? But what we don't pay is the other tax, right? And we channel that other tax into the foundations or into the trusts themselves. Those trusts, because they're separate taxpayers, they can complete 1031 exchanges, right? They can invest in qualified opportunity zone funds, right? They can do interest-only 25, 30-year installment sales that defer capital gains for 25 or 30 years, right? So we have all kinds of planning tools to work with, all right, to eliminate capital gains, defer capital gains, and to take care of the income from rents, even from our businesses, right? Some of these trusts are structured especially to operate operating businesses from, in other words, and they qualify for those same unlimited charitable contributions, all right? And all the rest of it we've already talked about, all right?
Absolutely. I mean, right now you gave me me and this audience a ton of knowledge.
I hope it wasn't
Like a ton of knowledge.
rushed.
Like you, like how do people reach you directly if they have questions, consultations? Like how do they reach you, Barry?
Okay.
How do they get in contact with you? This is
So the easiest way is via email. Okay.
the email.
Um, uh, it's not that I'm too good to be spoken to on the phone. It's not that way at all. It's just that
Okay.
it's hard to get through. That's all. Right.
Right.
We have a really good staff. The gal that is monitoring the questions, Ruth Benjamin, is my business partner. She's one of the most respected 1031 exchange qualified intermediaries in the entire country. She has an awesome staff, back office staff. All right. The easiest way to reach me is Barry, Barry, at deferthegainstax.com. Okay. And then Ruth can get people to my calendar. And she is not my personal assistant. I don't want to give anybody that idea. She is one smart cookie. One of the most complex and sometimes most effective tax planning structures is this thing called a tax deferred cash out approach. It is it's awesome. All right. It's terrific at large capital, deferring large capital gains for as long as 30 years. Okay. And there are hedge fund funded funding sources for those kinds of transactions that will only allow Ruth and her team to manage the process from start to finish for those transactions. She is super smart. I have some situations in my family. It's a big family. We have a couple of adult kids that have some pretty serious health issues. And Ruth reached out to me in January or so and said, let me help you. And she provided that back office staff for us so that I can spend most of my time having conversations like this, right? Knowing that somebody who's interested is going to be able to reach knowledgeable people through Ruth. All right. She knows an awful lot about all of the stuff we've been talking about tonight. And then I'm here to support her and to take care of things in that way. I want to say that Toby introducing me to you was terrific for me. Toby is a really smart guy himself. He and his partner James have some really good ideas for things. They've got, I've connected them with some really good funding sources, and the conversations that I've had with you, your energy, your interest in trying to sincerely do good things for other people, man, I so respect it, and I appreciate the time to talk with you tonight. I really do.
Barry, I appreciate it. No, I appreciate your time tonight. Like you gave me a ton of things to think about, especially with this foundation thing. Now you got me on another level on that situation. So I'm gonna have to talk to you offline on that.
Sure.
I appreciate this. I appreciate you giving me all this information. I got to go rewatch this thing. I mean, you gave me a ton of information. You got codes that you remember off the top of your tongue.
That's just because I'm old, man.
This is crazy, man. You know way too much. Hey, listen, I'm gonna make sure we have your contact information in the comments in the bottom of our show on all social media platforms. If anyone needs anything, reach out to Barry Bruce, reach out to Ruth Benjamin. I mean, ton of knowledge for anyone out there that's looking to organize yourself in a way to not only protect yourself, but also advance in the real estate space and other things too, of course.
Can I give you two fast, quick final points?
Yes, sir.
One is regarding the foundations. There are really important rules that we have to abide by. Don't try to do those things on your own.
100%. Yeah.
We need to follow the rules, cross the T's and dot the I's, and then they can be incredibly powerful. Okay. Second, and this may be a little awkward. There are a significant number of people who promote trusts online that I just want to caution everybody about. All right. If what you're hearing or what you're reading or what you're being told is that trusts of the more sophisticated kind that I've been describing tonight can help you defer capital gains in perpetuity. That's one of their favorite phrases. Right. If you're being told that it can help you utilize something called an extraordinary dividend to put off the payment of taxes on income from rental properties, et cetera, for generations, please be very, very careful. All right. The section of the tax code that those claims are based on is 643. And 643 is old. It's written in language that we don't use today like we did 70 years ago when it was introduced to the tax code. All right. And it absolutely does not do what these promoters online say it does. And the pace at which professionals, really highly credentialed attorneys, CPAs, et cetera, are writing articles in professional journals warning people about these so-called non-grantor, irrevocable, complex, discretionary spendthrift trusts and Section 643 of the code. You really need to take those concerns seriously and don't get yourself caught up in things that are going to create issues. There is nothing in the tax code that allows you to defer capital gains on the sale of real estate or any other capital asset, quote unquote, in perpetuity. And what that phrase in perpetuity means in their language is until the trust is terminated, right? So they tell you that the trust is a dynasty trust, which it is. They're intended to last for generations. You cannot defer those capital gains taxes for generations, right? It's just not there. So please be careful with that. I hate to end on that, but I just don't want to see.
I mean, at the end of the day, that's good information. That's good advice for anyone out there that's looking at stuff on social media. There's so much stuff on social media right now. Yes. We got to be careful on anything and everything we do. So it's good to get your advice on this. And like I say, you have a ton of knowledge that I need to keep picking your brain on. Barry, I appreciate this time. Ruth,
thank you so much.
Thank you for being in the background, looking at the comments. I appreciate it, Barry. We will be in touch. And
all right. Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
All right. Take care. All right.